I don't know how if there's a balance there, or if you end up sounding a particular way, and you know being become known as sounding that way, or how it works. But
Right. Yeah, I totally know what you mean. Like I come up against that all the time. Like I notice that a lot of my poems end up being like the same length a lot of the time. Like I feel like, if I reach a certain point, I'm like, oh, okay, cool, this is done. Or like I feel
yeah,
like I I want to use a lot of the same kind of structures, and I want to use a lot of the same words and a lot of the same subject matter. And it's a challenge, definitely, kind of working outside of your comfort zone. But I'm really glad you did. You produced a beautiful body of work that you brought to us for Boldface, and you won a prize for it. So,
yeah. Thanks a
um,
lot.
so we talked about your being influenced by a play earlier. Can you speak a little bit as to like who your current influences are, or just who you're reading right now?
Um, right now I'm reading basically whatever my professors tell me to.
I feel that pain. Yeah.
We're reading this book called Maximum Gaga the other day in class, which is really out there, really interesting, sparked some really cool conversation. Um, the Mean Free Path is another one we're going to start reading. We've been reading Horace, all kinds of stuff. But um, what I like reading, what I would go back to is I always go back to Anne Sexton. From the beginning, she's been my favorite poets, and weird and strange and dark and romantic.
Yeah.
So I love her. I've also been reading a lot of Kate Greenstreet, who is a not very well known poet, but unjustly unwell known, if that's a thing. She's terrific. She's actually coming to UT in the spring, and I'm ecstatic. She's really abstract, really um, like disjointed, kind of scattered, and just beautiful, beautiful language. I highly recommend her book, The Last Four Things. It kind of changed my life as far as poetry. So, and also Jericho Brown. He came to our university last spring,
Yeah.
and got to meet with him a little bit and talk about poetry. And he did a reading for us, and his book Please is just incredible.
Yeah.
So,
I actually discovered that he graduated from the University of Houston when I was interning for Gulf Coast, and I immediately bought Please, and I was just blown away by it. Yeah, he's an amazing, amazing poet.
it's
Um,
a great work.
yeah. Any other influences that maybe are outside of your genre? Maybe like, prose or creative nonfiction that maybe informs your work?
Um, hmm. I like novels. Like let's see, I read For Whom the Bell Tolls over the summer by Hemingway.
Yeah.
Uh, I was just a wreck the entire time I was reading that novel,
Yeah.
but it's a wonderful, wonderful book. I read a lot of like junk fiction, like
I,
um,
there's something to be said for that, I think. I actually feel like, you should just give yourself the permission to just kind of like freely take in all kinds of different forms of art. And, I feel like the graphic novel is something that was kind of like in an intellectual ghetto for a long time until something really valuable was brought to the surface with like Alan Moore's work and Ghost World and things like that. Like, and it was in an intellectual ghetto for a long time. And I think genre fiction is seeing, you know, some really interesting writers who are doing some interesting things like Stieg Larsson and things like that. So I just feel like junk fiction is fine. It's great.
yeah, and we kind of need like a break from, academic, very kind of like old and dated and intelligent reading every once in a while. Just like to read some Stephen King for a while, and once in a while, and give myself a break from all of that.
Yeah,
I'm
totally.
not afraid to admit it.
No, totally. So, how did you come to poetry? What's your story? Like as a as just a person, like, what was your first experience with poems? Like the first poems that really moved you, that made you kind of want to try your hand at it, and how have you developed as a poet?
I've recently come to credit my mom actually with my writing of poetry. Um, since I was really little, like maybe 10, 11, 12, she, well, probably before then, she kept a journal and, would not just have a journal, but would write poetry in it and stuff. And so I kind of got that from her. She would buy me like journals for Christmas and my birthday and stuff and give them to me. And so I have a collection that goes back to when I was like 13 years old and writing little sappy little existential
Yeah.
teenage poems that were just terrible. But it wasn't until like college really that I realized that, wow, this is something that I can take seriously. And I read Anne Sexton, and like I said, she was the first poet that really turned me on to poetry. And I just realized that, wow, she's not high and lofty sounding. She doesn't really sound like, any poetry I had heard, at that point. And wow, maybe I could do this.
Yeah. Cool. So when you say that you came to it at 13 years old, and you consider your early work sappy, which I do too. I just recently found an old sketchbook of mine that had a lot of poems in there. I was like, oh my gosh, I had a lot
Great
of work.
stuff.
What's that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
it's
said
just
it's great. It's great to have them.
yeah, but you can measure kind of how far you've come, right? You can kind of be like, oh, okay, so this was really vague, and now I've moved a little bit more toward the concrete. Like, I've really worked on controlling my sense of image, controlling metaphor, like, and you can kind of see how far you've come. But when you're writing, you can't really seem to break through certain barriers. What's your experience of that? Like when you go back and read your older work, I mean, even older work as old as maybe a year ago, I can kind of look at and be like, what was I doing? What was I thinking? Like, how do you think that development comes about just for you?
Um, well, I've noticed maybe within the last couple of years that I have kind of two collections of my own poetry, and one of them is stuff that I've written while I'm in school, and the other is stuff that I've written outside of school. And it usually ends up that the stuff that I write in school gets thrown away or completely reworked. I find that I just don't function very well in the workshop setting. I mean, it's good because it gets me writing and it gets me thinking about things, and I'm reading stuff uh, and being influenced by it, in great ways. But it does something to my work. It makes me, maybe like too self-conscious about what I'm writing, uh, to the point where it feels like disingenuous.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, because you're writing for this very specific workshop audience, and
right.
sir, and it does change your work. And I actually feel like the workshop is very violent to the actual process and violent to the work itself, but it does get you in touch with the reader. It gets you in touch with how your work is perceived from the outside, which is helpful. But I still think it's an interior process, So I agree with you on that.
Yeah, it's hard. It's definitely an important, not just important, but totally necessary thing to be aware of your audience and how they're responding to your work, I think. But also something that maybe gets in the way of the process at times.
Yeah.
So I forgot what your original question was, how that relates.
Yeah, how is it that you measure, like, you can go back and look at your 13-year-old poetry or possibly your 17-year-old poetry or your 20-year-old poetry and be like, okay, I had some work to do. How
Yeah,
do
right.
you how do you feel that how do you feel like you can access your future voice and break through barriers, and how do you feel like that growth comes about?